A critical week ahead for Ukraine, the movement toward and the inherent risks of a ceasefire summit. New Trump data requirements for college admissions, how to measure merit and weigh diversity. What does it mean to be branded a gangbanger or terrorist? In some cases, deportation, brutality, and no chance to explain. We learn more. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington, and I welcome you to the Takeout. Does craving a ceasefire mean carving up Ukraine? This seems to be the operative question for President Trump as momentum builds for a summit next week. Who attends and where remains unclear. Even more opaque, the purpose. Ukraine's president said today a ceasefire appears within reach if the U.S. and Europe turn up the pressure on Russia. That is a big and undefined if. For what it's worth, Bloomberg reported today the outline of a peace deal that would cede vast swaths of eastern Ukraine to Russia. Terms like this have been discussed before, and Ukraine has never been amenable to them because it would leave its future sovereignty at the mercy some months or years hence to a refitted and rested Russian army, meaning precious little sovereignty or future at all. A ceasefire would, of course, stop the bloodshed, but would not resolve Ukraine's territorial or political future. The question looming over all this appears to turn on the question of appetites for war. Is Russia exhausted? There's no sign of it. Ukrainians have been fighting through fatigue and impossible odds from the start. What is Europe's appetite for more war? What is President Trump's? How hard is Trump prepared to push Russia with new sanctions? Remember, today was supposed to be the sanctions day. Not a peep on that. Also, what is the president's stomach for tariffs against Russia's big oil consumers like India? These questions need answers before any successful summit can take place, meaning hard choices, one by one, appear to be landing inside something of a diplomatic pressure cooker, one with the lid tightening this weekend if it hasn't been sealed shut already. We will seek guidance on all this from John Sullivan, ambassador to Russia for President Trump in his first term and for President Biden. But first, we turn to our Olivia Rinaldi here at the desk. Olivia, great to see you. Not so long ago, meaning within the last hour, President Trump talked about this at the White House. Let's listen to that sound.
I think we're getting very close, and we're going to be announcing later on we're going to have a meeting with Russia. We'll start off with Russia, and we'll announce a location. I think the location will be a very popular one for a lot of reasons.
That soundbite has something very important in it. Meeting with Russia, start off with Russia.
Yep.
How I read that is Ukraine's not there.
That is the accurate way to read it. They're not there. They're not at the table for this. Trump is going to meet with Putin first, and that comes after Special Envoy Witkoff did and said there was a breakthrough. There was concrete evidence and details we finally got about what the Russians need to end the war. Now, we know the president has been talking with Zelensky, but wherever this is, it doesn't sound like he's invited to it. So this is first Trump meeting with Putin to get terms of a peace deal, you would hope, or to see that's what the ceasefire could potentially be. A reminder that Secretary Rubio has continued to say they're a long way from the finish line. He has continued to throw cold water on this in every interview he's had over the last 24 hours, saying
dismissive of the importance of a meeting,
right?
The necessity of laying down absolute preparatory commitments for a meeting to be successful.
He said if it's leader level, it's a ceasefire of magnitude or an end to the war altogether, essentially. But there's a long way to go before a leader-level visit. And then today, you heard the president say, yeah, we have a date, we have a location, and I'm going to announce it soon, probably today, maybe later on, perhaps in a True Social post. That's what the White House is telling us.
For those watching or listening, it could be any time tonight. It could be while we're on the air. It could be after we're on the air.
It could be now. I don't know. I haven't checked my phone. But it's possible, he says, that this meeting is going to happen between the two, which means either there's a lot of diplomatic work that's going to be done in the next week, or they're going into this without the idea that they're going to have some deliverable at the end of it. But it's hard to see a reality in which President Trump and President Putin sit down and there's not something concrete coming out of it. But the fact that President Zelensky is not there kind of leaves that door open a little bit, right?
It very much does. Olivia Rinaldi, thank you so very much. Former United States Ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, joins me now. John, it's great to see you. Thanks so much. I hope you heard my intro. I raised the question, does craving a ceasefire mean carving up Ukraine? Does it?
Well, the administration, senior administration officials, the president, the vice president, on down, have been talking about concessions that Ukraine would make, giving Crimea to Russia since the administration started. So the administration has been talking about this for a long time without the Ukrainians. And it's the Ukrainians who are fighting and dying. And no matter what President Trump says, Ukrainians are going to continue to fight and resist this Russian aggression. So the Ukrainians need to be included, and Zelensky has made that clear.
You're right, John, that there has been conversation about Crimea, even the Donbass. But this Bloomberg report today said Crimea, Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Bigger swaths of territory, things that the Ukrainians have never been willing to entertain.
Right. But think about it from Putin's perspective. Look at all the soldiers he's lost. Hundreds of thousands for that territory. The idea that he would surrender it is virtually unthinkable unless he was absolutely forced to do so. And he's not under that type of pressure right now.
And John, what about the optic value for Russian President Putin to meet with Trump as early as next week?
Well, it's huge. And, you know, I was reading Russian social media and state media earlier today, and they're focusing on a Trump-Putin meeting. And the one thing that Kremlin officials want to talk about is all the other things that Trump and Putin can talk about, commercial deals with U.S. businesses, the great relationship that could develop between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is an issue that needs to be resolved, but their real goal is a one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin where a lot of other things will be discussed. And that's where Putin thinks he can really gain some advantage.
And the president himself said today was the sanctions deadline day for a resolution here. No sanctions. How do you think Putin interprets that?
Well, it's just another example of the United States going wobbly. I mean, we were told that the president was going to get a deal between Russia and Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. It's just more talk. Putin doesn't talk. Putin acts. And he acts based on his perception of American strength and Western strength. And what he sees now is a weak and divided West. And he will continue to take advantage of that.
What about the Europeans? What clout, if any, do they have diplomatically or militarily to either persuade the president to do something different from the course he appears to be on presently or act independently?
Well, they're in a difficult position because they have lagged for so many years in building up their own defense capacity, relying on the United States to do the work that they themselves should have been doing. So they're way behind the curve. They are trying to catch up. They're doing the best they can right now. But without the United States support, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to continue to resist as successfully as Ukraine has been resisting this Russian aggression. The influence that the Europeans could have on President Trump, I'm skeptical that that's going to convince President Trump one way or the other.
And John, what do you think the Ukrainians are saying to themselves right now? Try to get a ceasefire and then negotiate from there in hopes of forestalling a deal that could leave them in a very weakened position? What are their options as they look at these headlines and this social media conversation in Russia?
Well, first, the one thing to consider as background, Major, is the fact that war weariness in Ukraine is really taking a toll. I've seen some reports and polls that suggest that Ukraine morale is really starting to dip. I mean, they've been being hammered by Russian rockets, drones, etc. And this war, years in length now, is really taking a toll on Zelensky and on the Ukrainian people. So certainly they want a ceasefire. Everybody with a heart wants a ceasefire. The president's absolutely right. No one wants to see this violence, these innocent people being killed in Ukraine. But the problem is that Putin, he doesn't want a ceasefire. He wants victory. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants victory. Everybody else wants peace and talks about a ceasefire. Putin wants victory on his terms. He's paid a lot to achieve this. Russian lives lost, treasure, the hit to the Russian economy. He's not just going to compromise because President Trump tells him to. He's got too much at stake here. His credibility, his vision of an new imperial Russia, he is not going to surrender his war aims. He's invested far too much in this.
Former Ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, I appreciate it very much, sir. Thank you for your time and expertise.
Thanks, Major.
CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan, joins me now here at the Conversation Corner. Margaret, thanks for coming out. Thanks for working through the choreography of the Takeout set. I appreciate that flexibility very much.
Thanks. How are you?
I'm very well. I'd like your impressions of the conversation I just had with Ambassador Sullivan and the day's events and what appears to be an important 5 or 6 days ahead for the future of Ukraine.
Well, I wish I could have heard him because he's always brilliant. But I will tell you, the ambassador knows very well Vladimir Putin. And what is clear here is that President Trump's team is hoping a summit will achieve what they have been unable to achieve to date, which is to actually get Vladimir Putin to negotiate giving back territory he seized from Ukraine. If you look at most of the reporting out there and what we have been hearing as well is Vladimir Putin is still saying, I want that eastern part of the country he seized. He also wants to hold on to Crimea. There's about 25% of the east that Ukrainian forces are still in. So does he try to get at the negotiating table what his forces couldn't get at the battlefield? And that's the question. The president tonight has said he's going to meet with Vladimir Putin. He didn't indicate that trilateral summit that we've heard is also being bandied about.
I also want to ask you for your expertise and perspective on the Middle East. The Security Cabinet for Benjamin Netanyahu has approved a plan to occupy Gaza. That has created tremendous international backlash and regional backlash. There's supposed to be a UN Security Council meeting on all this tomorrow. What should we think about as we ponder this decision and what its implications are in Gaza?
Well, what happened yesterday overnight was the announcement that the National Security Cabinet wants to go into at least Gaza City and really ramp up the military operations. This is the opposite of what President Trump was seeking here, which was peace or a ceasefire or a halt of
and return of the hostages.
And a return of the hostages, that's right. So part of the stepping up of military force always calls into question, how can the hostages survive during increased operations? We've seen no success in terms of actual agreement from concessions from Islamic Jihad or Hamas in regard to giving up their arms or ending the war. But it is really interesting to listen to what Prime Minister Netanyahu says because he continues to argue that this war needs to grind on, despite also claiming there are massive successes on the battlefield. So if there are massive successes in the battlefield, if Hamas is on its back foot, if force is successful at getting back hostages, then why are you in the same situation you've been in for nearly 2 years? Why do you have to continue extending it? And there's increased skepticism, certainly among diplomats, that he's actually seeking an end to this war, but rather an extension of his coalition, his political coalition to remain in power.
And as you know, Margaret, there's extensive reporting here and in Israel and even conversation among hostage families that this may be about political survival.
Yes.
Because there are these hard right members of his coalition who have basically told Netanyahu, if you don't follow what we want to do, which means stay in Gaza and continue the military effort, we will abandon your government, pull apart your coalition, and your political future would be in jeopardy.
And I think one of the things that gets sometimes lost in our understanding here in the United States is that this is, parliamentary system, the coalition government. You're there and remain in power because of the alliances you're able to continue forging and the confidence from those members. So if the prime minister loses those two far-right ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who have said they would oppose an end to the war, who believe that because of their version of interpreting the Bible, that Jews are meant to be in that land in Gaza specifically and in the West Bank, that there has to be Israeli ownership of that land, which is directly at odds with any kind of premise for a two-state solution or some peaceful outcome at the negotiating table. It says dominance. So how do you reconcile that when you have the extremes empowered at this moment? That's the problem.
And we should know, just for the viewers' benefit, that that particular interpretation of the map and the history, biblical and otherwise, is at odds with every previous Israeli administration since the existence of Israel. It is a hard right faction that has risen to this moment and is exerting so much influence over the Netanyahu government.
The far right in Israeli politics has never been more ascendant or powerful at this moment in time. There's no question about that. And you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been in power for decades because he's been able to form all these alliances, in a different place than he was decades ago. So for Americans who look at him and say, oh, this is slightly different than the man we knew, that's a large part of the politics. For example, when we talk about in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank, the Americans who have been killed there recently, too, that we have reported on, Palestinian Americans, when you hear American officials say, oh, the Israelis need to investigate, the part of that sense they're leaving out is that the man who oversees the police is one of those hard right ministers who believes that that land should not be given up. So that is why you hear, senators and others saying, there needs to be an American investigation because there's just a fundamental suspicion of the motivations.
Right. Not honest brokers in that particular part of the space. Margaret Brennan, as always, thank you very much. I appreciate it. You can watch Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan this Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern on CBS and 2 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News 24/7. Still to come on the Takeout, President Trump's new data demand on college admissions, policing affirmative action, or squashing diversity. We explore. Also, released from the brutal Ceasefire prison, Venezuelans deported in Trump's early days say they suffered beatings and humiliation. Plus, we talked about this yesterday. I guess we do have a Ruben Gallego watch. The Arizona Senator's Iowa State Fair experience. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to the Takeout. In 2023, the Supreme Court ruled race-based college admissions unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the opinion, said colleges and universities could consider race and life experiences in the admissions process, asserting the court was only blocking race as a determining factor in admissions. President Trump has gone a step further. Now requiring new data on admissions meant, it appears, to filter out race as part of the considerations at all. Here to discuss, Amalia Smirniotopoulos. She is a senior policy counsel and co-manager of the Legal Defense Fund's Equal Protection Initiative. Amalia, it's great to have you with me. Thanks for joining us. So,
yeah, thank you for having me.
There are about 4,000 colleges and universities in our country. 200 fall into the category of selective in the way that they go through this admissions process. What do we know about this requirement now for data and how the administration intends to use it?
So unfortunately, the memorandum from the president is short on detail about how it's actually going to be implemented in practice. What we know is that the president has laid out that he's going to be requesting that colleges and universities provide a wide variety of data, including data on quantitative measures of applicants and admitted students' academic achievements, including standardized test scores, GPAs, and other characteristics. But we don't know how this is actually going to play out in practice. It's unclear how this data will be managed or analyzed, given the steep staff cuts at the Department of Education. It's unclear how different schools are going to even report some of this data. For example, if your school is test optional, you don't require the SAT or the ACT in order to enter, they have nothing to report for that category. It's unclear what data is going to be made public. And I think most importantly, it's unclear exactly what kinds of quantitative measures the federal government will collect. And part of this is a key question because there are many kinds of admissions criteria that we know do actually exclude people disproportionately, people of color from admissions, things like athletic recruiting or preferences for elite private schools. But what it looks like is happening is that the Trump administration wants to look at a very narrow definition of merit and to pressure schools to conform to those measures to the exclusion of Black students and other students of color.
That's a key point you made, and I just want to give you a chance to repeat it for my audience's benefit, because legacy admissions, meaning admissions of those in families who previously attended, are a big thing. Athletic scholarships are a big thing, and both can be, and historically have, and the data reveal this, been impediments for people of color entering higher education.
Yes, and I think, unfortunately, it's not clear that the Trump administration plans to collect any data on some of those practices. Instead, all that we know that they're going to look at are things like SAT and ACT scores, GPAs, and other quote-unquote applicant characteristics, which are really a narrow measure of the merit of the students applying to and being admitted to schools.
And it's been my experience in reading about this that universities and colleges want to achieve diversity for themselves, but also for the student population and the expectations students bring to the higher education experience they, in fact, covet.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think the order from the president fundamentally misunderstands how college admissions works and what it's really about. The reality is that places like Harvard and Duke and other elite schools have more applicants with high test scores and grades than they have spots available, which is why those schools and many other colleges look at a wide variety of factors in putting together their class. You know, we are all more than how well we did on one test we took on one day. Holistic college admissions practices that value all of the qualities and contributions that students make understand that. The Supreme Court understood that in the Students for Fair Admissions decision when it explained that colleges and universities can consider the impact of race on students' lives. But I worry that the Trump administration does not understand that and will use this data collection to pressure schools to narrow what they consider in order to conform to this idea that only test scores matter and that we are not all of the sum of our parts.
Amalia Smirniotopoulos, I appreciate your time and your perspective. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
As you know, we've been closely watching as Texas lawmakers feud over redistricting efforts in that state. But Texas not alone. Many other states may redraw their congressional maps this year. What are the implications? We're going to discuss that next, right here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Happy Friday, by the way. I don't know how I missed that earlier, but happy Friday. Here's a look at what else we, and now you, are watching this evening. Sources tell CBS News the Trump Justice Department has expanded its investigation of New York Attorney General Letitia James. It now includes her office's investigations of the Trump Organization and the National Rifle Association. Spokesperson said James stands behind successful litigation against the Trump Organization and the NRA. The DOJ was already investigating James for alleged mortgage fraud. James has denied wrongdoing. NASA announced today that astronaut Jim Lovell has died. He commanded the Apollo 13 mission in 1970 when an onboard oxygen tank exploded thousands of miles into their journey to the moon. Lovell and his team adjusted course and safely returned the spacecraft to Earth. Lovell began his career in aviation as a Navy pilot before moving to NASA in 1962. He was 97 years old and memorably portrayed by Tom Hanks in the 1995 movie Apollo 13. And in Texas, the House of Representatives failed to reach a quorum yet again. That happened today. Texas Republicans threatened to cut budgets and move to arrest Democrats who have fled the state, thus preventing a quorum. The Texas House is set to reconvene Monday. Hunter Woodall joins me now. Hunter, you've been following this saga in Texas as we have here at The Takeout. I want to play for you sound from the governor, Greg Abbott, on a podcast recently. I think it was as early as today, because it gets to this question. Where does it all end? You know, wake me when it's over. Well, Governor Abbott laid out what he thinks might be the sum total of all this. Let's listen.
How does this end?
The way it always does, and that is the Democrats always come back, and it's going to end with these maps being passed. And, you know, what I'm thinking now is if they don't start showing up, I may start expanding it. We may make it 6 or 7 or 8 new seats we're going to be adding on the Republican side.
So, to level set, 5 seats is the Trump requested goal for redrawing maps and getting 5 more favorable Republican seats out of the Texas map. But this is not just a Texas situation. This has spawned conversations about redistricting across the country.
That's exactly right, Major. I mean, this fight is now spilling into multiple states. You know, you have California Democrats saying, hey, they might try and redraw those maps. That could essentially offset the Texas gains here that Republicans are trying to make. But it also could expand to other Republican states, Missouri, Indiana,
Florida,
you know, they've talked about. And it really could create this back and forth tension that could absolutely overtake some of these midterm dynamics. You know, we know midterms are supposed to be, you know, pretty tough for the party in power. But right now, it's, you know, upsetting the apple cart.
And the audience can see a map of the states we just name-checked. And if I looked at the reporting on this today, which I did, the estimates are if you take all those red states and redraw the maps, you could get to maybe 12 plus R. If you look at those Democratic states, you get to plus 8. So maybe that's 4, a net gain of 4 for Republicans. If there's a wave, that's not going to hold back the wave. But if it's close, who knows?
And that's the part that we can't quite shake here is how much does this actually end up mattering to voters too? Is, you know, because when I talked to a pollster this week, he made the point, usually redistricting doesn't really move the needle with your average voters. But what Texas Republicans are trying here mid-decade, it might break through. It might cause more of this because we're not used to seeing this back and forth, you know, Republicans and Democrats, both parties, you know, go and they redraw maps like this. But doing this mid-decade in such a harsh way, it's really gaining attention.
And one of the underlying questions in this overall strategy for Republicans and Democrats is, does it light a fire in your base? And whose fire is lit more? Republicans like, oh, we're sticking it to the Democrats, the liberals, the progressives, we're redrawing the maps, we should have done it long ago? Or do Democrats say, as they are now saying in Texas, there is something much larger at stake here and everybody needs to get involved? So this has activating power, not just in the states we've name-checked, but maybe nationwide.
Major, it's funny you mentioned that because I was thinking about this today. You know, we're watching the DNC, Democrats sending out fundraising emails about this. We're watching DNC Chair Ken Martin show up and, you know, say, hey, we stand with these Texas Democrats. Democrats have been, you know, it's been a bit of a mess for them so far in these early Trump, you know, months of the second term. This has given them an issue that they think they can rally around, that they can build support around. And that might not have been Republicans' intent with this.
We will stay tuned. As always, Hunter Woodall, I thank you and appreciate it. Last year, I ate my way through the Iowa State Fair, and I highly recommend that to those who haven't had the chance. For political animals, attractions extend beyond the famous butter cow and pork on a stick. There are caucus voters to court, even if only aspirationally. Arizona Democratic Senator Ruben Gallego went courting. He spoke with our Ed O'Keefe.
We don't normally come to the Iowa State Fair just 8 months into a new presidency, and we certainly don't come with Democrats when this isn't a state that they put on the calendar as an early contest anymore. But we spent part of today with Arizona Senator Ruben Gallego, who's only 8 months into his first term in the Senate. We spent the morning with him at a meat processing plant in Marshalltown, Iowa, and now he's here at the Iowa State Fair. This is very early for someone who is on the list of people being talked about as a potential future president or vice president to show up. But consider, the Democratic Party is more unpopular than ever before, according to recent polling. And without control of the White House or Congress, there's a big leadership void. So guys like Gallego, who are not yet household names, are trying to fill that void and suggest to the party base, I'm someone who could lead us into the future. So we talked a little bit about that this morning after his tour of that plant in Marshalltown. But let's not dance around it. You're thinking about running for president, right?
We're thinking about how we're going to be able to win as many places as possible to help me get some friends in the Senate and Congress to restore some sanity, reel back some of these crazy, Medicaid cuts, and maybe try to get some people a little working reliefs that could actually make a living.
And then maybe one day.
Keep on fishing. I ain't biting on that one.
Gallego and his staff do very little to tamp down the talk of him one day perhaps running for president. He is going to be on the other side of the state in Davenport on Saturday for a town hall meeting designed to call out his concerns with the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. And then he's going back to Arizona for a series of town hall meetings with his own constituents. Because after all, Major, he does have a day job.
My thanks to Ed O'Keefe. Next, President Trump's new directive to take on drug cartels, how the U.S. military could be used to target drug trafficking in Latin America. We'll explore next here on The Takeout. We are following a developing and possibly dangerous situation around Atlanta's Emory University, where police are responding to an active shooter. Here is what we know now. An alert from the university went out about 4 p.m. Eastern. A large police presence is at the moment concentrated at a CVS near the campus. The FBI, we are told, is monitoring and has been alerted to this situation and is en route. We're going to continue to monitor this situation, and we will tell you more as we learn it. The New York Times reports President Trump has secretly ordered the Pentagon to conduct military actions against some Latin American drug cartels. This after the administration branded several as terrorist organizations. Olivia Rinaldi is back with me now at the desk. So good to have you here. I want to play for you sound from Secretary of State Marco Rubio about the necessity of the designation and what it might imply about future military involvement. Let's listen.
We cannot continue to just treat these guys as local street gangs. They have weaponry that looks like what terrorists, in some cases armies have. They control territory in many cases. Those cartels extend from the Maduro regime in Venezuela, which is not a legitimate government. We don't recognize the Maduro regime as legitimate. It is a criminal enterprise, all the way to the various different cartels that operate in Mexico. And in between, you find them in Ecuador, you find them in Guatemala, you find TDA, what people would call street gangs, but actually are operating as criminal enterprises.
Mexico's president today, Claudia Sheinbaum, said America's not coming to Mexico. We've always rejected that, but there are things to pay attention to here in this space.
Oh, certainly. This is a major escalation, especially in the fight against drugs, the war on drugs that has continued. But it's in the context of what we've seen this administration do as it relates to our counterparts down in Latin America. So we've seen those fentanyl tariffs, right? The tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China to really, lash back, prevent the flow of illicit drugs coming across the border on both sides. We have seen this White House through executive orders and legislation on Capitol Hill crack down on the U.S. border. But still, it doesn't seem like it's enough because now another escalation. The president says, or at least we've seen from this report, that they are now directing the Pentagon to begin using military force against these organizations. And you heard from Secretary Rubio, they're well-funded, they have stable income, and they have a lot of weapons. So certainly the question would be, under what pretense would they use this force? And the president was actually asked about this today when he was at that meeting with Azerbaijan and Armenia, if he would send the military to Latin America. He did not answer specifically, but he said, we're playing a tough game. So clearly this is a major focus of this administration, and they're willing to bet it all there.
Olivia, we have about 30 seconds for this, so I apologize for that. But there was other news today about the IRS commissioner and a rotating set of names there.
Right. So Billy Long was confirmed by the U.S. Senate about 2 months ago to serve as the IRS chief. He was the 6th person this year, by my count, to lead that department. The IRS, which collects your taxes, and you have to deal with that, and we all have to deal with that. And it's no fun for anyone, and apparently not for the IRS chief themselves, because after 2 months, the administration removed him. It appears they're going to give him an ambassadorship to Iceland. And Secretary Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is now going to serve as the acting commissioner of the IRS. So if you're looking at this administration, look at the roles that are being consolidated. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, also the National Security Advisor, also the National Archivist. Secretary of State or Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, now the IRS chief. So we're seeing these major roles in Washington now being played by one person.
And funneled directly through the White House.
Yep.
Olivia Rinaldi, I appreciate you very much today. Thanks so much. Not once, but twice. Hundreds of Venezuelan men were released from the CBS mega prison in El Salvador last month after being deported there by the Trump administration. What they're saying and sharing about living in a facility with a history of alleged human rights abuses. That's next here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Bewildered, frightened, angry. That's the description given to journalists by 9 Venezuelan men that were deported to the infamous CBS prison in El Salvador. They and hundreds of others sent there by the Trump administration returned to Venezuela last month as part of a prisoner swap. One of the people behind the article joins me now. Micah Rosenberg is an investigative reporter covering immigration for ProPublica. Micah, I'm grateful for your time. There is terminology and then there's court documents. The terminology from the White House is all of these people were violent criminal thugs. What do the court records tell us? How many did and didn't?
Well, yes, that's exactly right. And we set out to find out what was the difference between what the government was saying about all of these men who were sent to this maximum security prison in El Salvador and what the reality was about what the government knew about them before they sent there. So we spoke to more than 100 of their family members and their attorneys. We combed through thousands of pages of court records, both in the United States and abroad in the countries where they lived before. And we obtained internal government records about how the government themselves classified them. And what we found is that the vast majority of more than 230 of these Venezuelans who were sent there had not been convicted of crimes in the United States, and much fewer of them had been convicted of violent crimes, which was very different from how the government was portraying them as all the worst of the worst. And so we found that actually the government themselves knew that that wasn't the case.
And what was their experience inside CBS based on the interviews you and your colleagues at ProPublica did?
Well, after 4 months, these men were released almost as quickly and with as little explanation as they were imprisoned. And because we had been in touch with their families over the course of this time where they'd been held completely incommunicado, not able to speak at all, we were able to speak with close to a dozen of them soon after they were released. And they spoke of really some terrifying conditions, including beatings, some which have had lasting impacts on them. One man spoke about an injury to his groin, which is still bothering him. Another man who has worried that he's lost vision. We heard about hunger strikes and very difficult conditions. And this is really the first time that that people inside this prison have been able to talk about what it's like on the inside. You know, I should say that the government of El Salvador has denied that they were mistreated, but this is from the firsthand accounts of these men.
Micah, what role did tattoos play in their apprehension?
Well, one thing that the Trump administration has said is that all of these men are members of a Venezuelan gang called the Tren de Aragua. But what we learned through our review of court documents is that in many of the cases, sometimes the men were tagged because of their tattoos. There were a certain set of tattoos that law enforcement had identified as affiliated with the gang, but we spoke to many law enforcement experts who says that this gang is actually not using tattoos as an indicator of membership. In other cases, people were tagged because of their social media accounts or because they had crossed the border in a big group and a Tren de Aragua member had been allegedly with them. The government says that it uses a wide range of evidence to identify these men, but we provided them with the evidence that we found on every individual, and they did not give additional information about almost all of them.
Important reporting. Micah Rosenberg, ProPublica. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back. Since retaking office, President Trump has expanded the scope of presidential power and denounced federal courts that have ruled he has overstepped. I spoke with political historian and journalist Jay Cost about that, and here's part of our conversation. You've thought long and hard about the institutional framework of the American government, its strengths, its weaknesses. Give me your evaluation right now about what President Trump is doing to harm them, to strengthen them, or to reimagine them.
That's a great question, and thanks for having me. I think one of the great damages that Trump has done, but not just Trump. I think Trump is continuing on in a string of presidents dating back for a generation or more now, which is the effort to expand executive power at the expense of the legislature. And I think you see this probably most clearly in his tariff agenda. Putting aside the merits of industrial protection, Congress clearly vests the power to set tax rates, including on imported goods, in Congress. That's where the Constitution vests it. Now, in fairness to Trump, Congress has given that power away. And I think one of the big stories of our time has been the extent to which the legislative branch has allowed the executive branch to just run roughshod over it. And I think that's a story that includes Presidents Trump and Biden, but also President Obama, and I would say President George W. Bush as well.
You've heard the Trump argument that the executive branch is one thing, but the administrative state is another, and that administrative state more or less is hostile to Trumpism and therefore hostile to the interests of the American public that elected him to a second term. Therefore, he is directing much of his ire, procedurally and otherwise, at that administrative state. Evaluate that argument and its potential effect.
Yeah, it's an old argument. I mean, it was an argument that Andrew Jackson made all the way back in 1829 when he asserted that rotation in office was a good thing. Jackson's point is that the offices of the administrative state or the executive branch at the time were the property of the people, and so that the president had the power to sort of remove officers from the government as he saw fit. I think there are merits to that. I mean, there's always a balance, right? And there's a tension here. We do not want an administrative state that is independent entirely of the political process, because then it'll become a force unto themselves. But at the same time, we want the administrative state to administer the laws in a neutral and fair and just fashion, and that requires some independence from politics. There's no clear line one way or the other on this. And a lot of it, I think, is entangled with partisan sentiments on both sides of the aisle.
And Jay, how do you evaluate the president's decision very recently to fire the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or to relentlessly jawbone, and I think that's putting it mildly, the chairman of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I think both of them indicate a very aggressive posture that the president has towards his executive capacity under the Constitution. The executive power is vested in the president, and the president is vested with the responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Presidents over time have been more deferential. Trump is not deferential, certainly not in Trump 2.0. The second term of the Trump administration has taken a very aggressive posture. And in so doing, I think, has really challenged traditional notions of bureaucratic independence, because, of course, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is one of those government agencies that should be many orders of magnitude removed from the political process.
You argued in your book in 2015, A Republic No More, that there was a kind of built-in corruption in American government, and that predated Trumpism. How do you look at that argument now in the advent of not just one but two Trump terms?
Yeah, I think that the trends that I found when I was writing that book have to do with the size and scope of government, but also the way in which the government goes about accomplishing certain tasks, like, for instance, providing health insurance or health care to the elderly. The government itself does not actually provide it. It does that through the Veterans Administration, but Medicare is contracted through doctors and nurses in hospitals. And the government does this for all sorts of industries, for all sorts of tasks. And these sorts of relationships that the government establishes with what I would call mediators create avenues for what I would think are political corruption, not outright law breaking or dirty dealing or anything like that, but the opportunity for these interests to influence public policy for their own ends. That is not really a phenomenon that Trump began. Certainly not, but it is not one that he's all too concerned about. And I think in a lot of respects, the attitude among a lot of pro-Trump conservatives is not so much about cleaning government up, but using the power of government for the sake of their own interests and their own factions.
You can find, and I hope you will, my full interview with Jay Cost on CBSNews.com and your favorite podcast platform.